people of the Cold War, the forgotten heroes of other people's wars. Prologue. May 9th, 1945. The war did not end. It simply changed its name. The Great Patriotic War gave way to the Cold War, invisible, undeclared, without parades. And this war had its own soldiers. Tens of thousands of Soviet officers, translators, military advisors left for foreign lands. Korea, Vietnam, Egypt, Syria, Angola, Ethiopia, Mozambique. They were forbidden to speak Russian in the skies of foreign countries. Their documents were taken away before each flight. They were told, "If you are captured, we do not know you." They defended the skies of Hanoi against American B-52s. They taught African guerrillas how to fire grenade launchers. They sat in ambushes in the Angolan savanna, where the heat melted their automatic weapons. They died in deserts and jungles, and their names remained classified for decades. This is not a story of politicians and generals. This is a story of ordinary people whom the motherland sent beyond the horizon and forgot when they got into trouble. This is a tale of those who carried out orders in complete silence and returned home, if they returned at all, without orchestras or flowers. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union maintained active military cooperation with more than 40 countries across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. In Angola alone, Vietnam, Laos, Somalia, and Ethiopia, between 1965 and 1991, 46,833 Soviet military personnel served as advisors, specialists, and translators. Among them were 523 generals and admirals. In these countries, 178 people died, including 4 generals. This is their story. Part 1. The Scale of the Invisible War. After the end of World War II, tens of thousands of Soviet military personnel fulfilled their international duty beyond the borders of our motherland. By the beginning of the 1980s, the USSR was actively cooperating militarily with more than 40 countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Even long before the war in Afghanistan began, the USSR sent large military units and formations abroad. The Korean War of 1950 to 1953 is a prime example, where the 64th Soviet Fighter Aviation Corps fought against American pilots. It numbered up to 26,000 personnel. In the 1970s and 1980s, in addition to Afghanistan, troops were periodically sent to other countries. For instance, as part of limited groupings of PVO and VVS forces, about 15,000 Soviet military personnel served in Egypt in 1970 to 1972, and more than 8,000 in Syria in 1983 to 1984. What did fulfilling international duty abroad actually entail? Soviet military personnel were sent there to assist regimes friendly to the USSR and national liberation movements in building their armed forces, repelling external aggression, and in many cases, fighting against internal armed opposition. The geography of Soviet military presence is staggering. Asia: Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, India, Indonesia. The Middle East: Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Yemen. Africa: Angola, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Somalia, Congo, Nigeria. Latin America: Cuba, Nicaragua, El Salvador. In Angola, the Soviet contingent numbered about 11,000 personnel. Slightly more were stationed in Ethiopia. The largest grouping was in Mozambique, approximately 30,000 people. What did they do there? They prepared local armies, built air defense systems, organized intelligence operations. Soviet officers were attached to the staff of divisions and brigades, served as advisors to commanders, and worked as instructors in training centers. They lived in the same conditions as local soldiers: tents, dugouts, heat, insects, tropical diseases, constant threat of ambush. In Africa, our advisors were simply called the Russians. To the locals, they were mysterious people from a distant country who could fix any engine, teach how to fire any weapon, and never panicked under fire. Part 2. 4 continents and 3 oceans. The Soviet naval presence during the Cold War was equally extensive. The Soviet Navy had basing agreements with numerous countries. Albania from 1955 to 1962, Egypt from 1967 to 1972, Somalia from 1964 to 1978, and Ethiopia from 1977 to 1991. A number of other countries had port access agreements with the Soviet Union, which, while not amounting to full-fledged military bases, allowed for crucial naval replenishment and repair capabilities. Soviet air bases at various points included facilities in Egypt, Ethiopia, Somalia, Yemen, Cuba, Guinea, Angola, and Vietnam. These bases were vital for projecting Soviet power and influence far from its borders. The tasks of military service off the coast of West Africa, with port calls in Luanda, were carried out by ships from the Baltic Fleet, including the large anti-submarine ship Obrasowie and the patrol ships Bodry and Newcrotomy. Separate naval assault battalions from the Baltic Fleet's marine infantry also served here for 6 months each year aboard large landing ships. All of them were part of the 30th Operational Squadron, later Brigade, of the Northern Fleet during this period. The naval presence was not merely symbolic. Off the coast of Angola, Soviet sailors were tasked with protecting and defending Soviet commercial and fishing vessels, which were under constant threat of sabotage. Between 1975 and 1991, naval saboteurs targeted and damaged more than 15 civilian ships belonging to various countries and companies. Among them were the East German vessel Arendsee, the Angolan ship Luanga, the Cuban steamer Havana, and the Soviet dry cargo ships Kapitan Cherkov and Kapitan Wisla-Bokov, which in 1986 delivered about 20,000 tons of weapons and ammunition to Angola for its army and the SWAPO and ANC partisans. Part 3. Do not surrender alive. The most terrifying instructions Soviet military personnel received before being sent abroad was this: in case of capture, the state does not know you. USSR Minister of Defense Marshal Andrei Grechko, when seeing off Soviet fighter pilots to Egypt in March 1970, warned them literally, "Keep in mind, comrades, if you are shot down beyond the Suez Canal and captured, we do not know you. You'll have to get out on your own." Practically, this meant that the state absolved itself of all responsibility for its citizens captured abroad. On one hand, fly and shoot down the enemy. On the other, get out on your own. How to get out, our pilots protecting Egypt's skies understood without words. They always kept a pistol ready with a round in the chamber. Soviet military personnel were formally forbidden from directly participating in combat operations, according to directives from the USSR Minister of Defense. The wars in Korea and Afghanistan, which involved limited troop contingents, as well as conflicts in Vietnam and other countries where our missile crews and pilots defended their peaceful skies by shooting down Mirages, Phantoms, and B-52s, were more the exception than the rule. The prohibition on participating in hostilities in many countries was primarily due to the possibility of our servicemen being captured by the enemy. The Soviet leadership understood that in the conditions of the Cold War, any captured Soviet officer or soldier was an effective weapon in the ideological struggle between the sides. No documents were allowed to be carried. Identification cards, military IDs, personal numbers, everything stayed at home. Foreign passports were confiscated immediately upon entering the country. The only document a Soviet serviceman abroad might possess was a driver's license obtained from the local traffic police, if their duties required driving a vehicle. To the enemy, a person captured in military uniform without insignia was simply a mercenary. No rights of a prisoner of war. Part 4. Legends and false names. Preparation for a foreign assignment began long before departure. Servicemen received a legend, a cover story that had to be memorized and never forgotten. Warrant Officer N. Pestretsov, captured in Angola, repeated during interrogations by South African counterintelligence the legend he had learned during his preparation in the 10th Main Directorate of the General Staff. I am a civilian auto mechanic from the Kaliningrad branch of the gas plant. I was repairing damaged vehicles, and I ended up in the combat zone by accident. He spent almost a year and a half in a South African prison. They tried to break him, force him to admit he was an officer. He held on. He was freed thanks to the efforts of the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs and secret contacts between intelligence services. But when a high-level commission arrived from Moscow to investigate the deaths of Soviet citizens, learning that Pestretsov had been taken prisoner while sobbing over the body of his murdered wife, they recorded in the official report, Pestretsov N.F. behaved inappropriately during the battle. Inappropriately, in the Commission's understanding, presumably meant lying dead next to his wife. Part 5. The Angolan Cauldron of 1981. August 1981. The Angola-Namibia border. The 11th Infantry Brigade of the Angolan Army, along with Soviet advisors, was surrounded by South African troops. Military translator Lieutenant L. Krasov recalled, "We were shelled from the air and leaflets were dropped." The text stated that the bearer, if they have with them captured or personally killed Angolan officers, communists and Soviet advisors, is granted the right to exit the encirclement. A plot worthy of a Hollywood action movie. They were given 1 day to decide. And the day before, signallers of the 11th Brigade received a coded message from the advisor to the commander of the 5th Military District, roughly stating, "Hold out to the last, do not surrender alive." L. Krasov and several other advisors managed to escape the fiery ring alive. But not everyone was so lucky. In that battle, 2 Soviet officer advisors and 2 women, the wives of advisors, were killed. Moreover, as Angolan soldiers, participants in those battles recounted to the advisor to the National Political Commissar of the Angolan Army, Colonel P. Krupilin, they witnessed an advisor to the brigade's artillery chief, finding himself surrounded by South African soldiers, first shoot his wife with his pistol, and then kill himself. Part 6. The Ethiopian Captivity. June 1978, Ethiopia. A separate medical battalion fell into a Somali ambush. 5 servicemen were killed in the battle. Lieutenant Colonel N. Udalov was taken by militants into Somali territory and is still considered missing in action. Others were luckier. Colonel Y. Kalistratov, Lieutenant Colonel E. Chirayev, and translator Lieutenant A. Kuvaldin spent almost 3 years in captivity with the opposition Eritrean Liberation Front. 3 years in captivity, no communication with their homeland, no hope of exchange. They were held in dugouts, fed once a day, moved from place to place to hinder any search efforts. They were freed thanks to the efforts of the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the secret contacts of foreign intelligence officers with their foreign colleagues. They returned home completely changed people. The most astonishing aspect: our servicemen who ended up in captivity could not even be considered prisoners of war under the International Convention, with all the ensuing consequences. Identity cards, military IDs, personal numbers, birth certificates and other documents, absolutely everything was forbidden to take abroad. Soviet foreign passports were confiscated immediately upon entering the country. Part 7. The Syrian Epic. 1982. The Lebanon War. Syria was drawn into a large-scale conflict with Israel. Soviet military advisors worked with Syrian units, and Soviet-made air defense systems protected the skies over the Bekaa Valley. Israeli aviation launched massive strikes. Soviet air defense crews engaged in battle. Losses were on both sides, but officially there were no Soviet troops in Syria. In 1983 to 1984, more than 8,000 Soviet military personnel were sent to Syria. This was a full-scale army operation that went unreported in the news. Soldiers were forbidden to write home about where they were. Letters passed through strict censorship. Equipment was camouflaged to look local. Uniforms were repainted. Medals were learned about many years after returning, if they were learned about at all. Soviet military specialists in Syria, as elsewhere, faced immense moral, psychological, and daily hardships. They lived in conditions far from comfortable, often on the front lines, always aware that the state would not acknowledge them if something went wrong. Part 8. The Vietnam Campaign. Spring 1965. The Americans began massive bombing of North Vietnam. The Soviet leadership made a decision to send not just weapons, but people to Vietnam. Operation Vietnam Campaign was top secret. Military personnel were dressed in civilian clothes before departure. Their letters from there passed through harsh censorship. They wrote home that they were vacationing in an exotic country. In total, about 10,000 Soviet military personnel were sent to Vietnam. Their main task was to teach the Vietnamese the military craft, deploy the air defense system, and cover Hanoi and Haiphong from American air raids. In addition to personnel, about 2,000 tanks, 700 aircraft, and 7,000 artillery pieces were sent. Soviet pilots and anti-aircraft gunners shot down American planes, but remained in the shadows. In official reports, victories were attributed to their Vietnamese comrades. The living conditions in Vietnam were harsh. Jungle, heat, humidity, tropical diseases. The food was unusual, and the water often unsafe. Soviet advisors lived among the Vietnamese, shared their hardships, and earned their respect through professionalism and dedication. Part 9. The daily life of advisors. What was the daily life of a Soviet advisor in Africa like in the 1980s? Eyewitness accounts paint a vivid picture. Soviet military missions were scattered throughout Angola. They typically consisted of one or several one- or two-story cottages, usually located in the safest possible areas of a city, with well-covered approaches, surrounded by several rows of barbed wire or metal mesh. The missions had autonomous power and water supply, and even equipped Russian bathhouses. The advisors usually set up these missions themselves, not relying much on the Angolans. On the territory, one or two armored personnel carriers or reconnaissance vehicles stood at the ready, depending on the mission's size. There were service and personal quarters. The missions were equipped with radio stations for communication with Luanda, a movie projector, a mess hall, and a bomb shelter, usually a deep pit dug in the red, crumbly Angolan earth. The security of these Soviet military settlements was provided by FAPLA soldiers or Cubans. In the most dangerous areas, the approaches to Soviet military missions were guarded by government army tanks and APCs. In some warring provinces, the wives of our advisors couldn't even step outside the mission gates. They only knew one road, from the airport and back. In Luanda and some other cities where conditions were safer, advisors and specialists lived throughout the city. In the capital, there were 17 places of compact residence for Soviet military personnel. The largest even had their own code names. For example, on the central square Kinakshikshi stood the Kuka building, named after the huge, once glowing inscription Kuka on the roof, advertising a popular brand of Luandan beer. Another large settlement for our foreign specialists was Ararat, located not far from the military political school named after Commander Bekaa. The same building housed the cultural center of our trade mission, a cinema, and an exhibition hall. In 1987 to 1988, the outskirts of Bekaa Valley became a fierce battlefield between Angolan, Cuban, and South African forces, involving hundreds of tanks and APCs, dozens of combat aircraft and helicopters. The fact that Soviet military personnel were fighting, getting wounded, and dying there was never written or spoken about in the USSR. In 1989, official Moscow, through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, stated that Soviet military advisors do not participate in combat operations abroad. When in February 1990, Angolan government troops, with the participation of our advisors, conducted an operation to defeat the UNITA grouping and captured its stronghold Mavinga, a UN commission flew to Luanda for an inspection. The day before, all our advisors and military translators in Bekaa Valley were urgently evacuated by the plane of the chief military advisor in Angola, General P. Gusev, to Manong, and our military mission was sealed. Only after the commission finished its work, having confirmed that no Soviets were in the combat zone, did all Soviet military personnel, on the orders of the chief military advisor, return to where they officially could not have been. Part 10. Returning Home and the Legacy of the Cold War. They returned on regular flights, without orchestras, without television cameras, in civilian clothes with suitcases containing their trophies, African masks, Vietnamese conical hats, Egyptian hookahs. Wives met them at train stations. Children didn't recognize them. At work, colleagues would ask, "Well, how was your trip?" They would answer, "Normal," and that was it. No benefits, no veteran of combat action status for most of them. They didn't participate in official wars. They simply fulfilled their international duty. It was only in the 2000s, when many documents were declassified, that their exploits began to be spoken about aloud. Veterans of Angola, Ethiopia, Vietnam, Egypt created their own unions, wrote memoirs, met with young people. They wanted their war not to remain nameless. February 15th became the official day of remembrance for Russians who performed their duty beyond the fatherland, established by federal law of the Russian Federation on November 29, 2010, in the state list of days of military glory and memorable dates in Russia. Today, the regions where Soviet specialists fought are back in the news. The Middle East, Africa, Asia. Wars are raging again. Blood is being spilled again. But the memory of those who half a century ago defended foreign skies and foreign lands on the orders of their motherland remains alive. They were soldiers of the Cold War. They didn't choose where to go. They simply did their job. 46,000 Soviet military personnel passed through the world's hotspots. 178 of them never returned. 4 generals died on foreign soil. 10 people were captured, and only 4 lived to see their release. They didn't consider themselves heroes. They simply followed orders. But for us, they remain an example of loyalty to duty and the ability to survive where survival seems almost impossible. This was their war, quiet, unknown, but it happened, and the memory of it must not disappear. After completing their service abroad, Soviet forces were withdrawn from all bases outside Cold War-era Soviet boundaries between 1989 and 1994. What remained thereafter were mostly legacy bases in independent states made up of former Soviet republics. Yet the human legacy endures, in the stories passed down, in the veterans' organizations that keep the memory alive, in the slowly declassified documents that reveal the truth about this hidden front of the Cold War. These men were the silent soldiers of a silent conflict, and their sacrifices deserve a place in history.